Ambassador Velkith had studied 847 species in her 300 years of service to the Sereni Collective. She was the most decorated xenologist in the known galaxy. She had written the definitive guide on predicting species behavior. Every sapient race, she believed, followed the same basic pattern. They developed intelligence. They developed moral understanding. And then they acted on that understanding as naturally as they breathed. The Thornaki always chose collective survival. The Luminari always pursued harmony. The Kelvorn always obeyed their hierarchy. When their brains told them something was right, they did it. When their brains told them something was wrong, they did not do it. This was how consciousness worked. This was how the universe made sense. Then the collective council assigned Velkith to Earth. She arrived on a Tuesday in what the humans called autumn. The leaves were changing colors, falling from trees in ways that reminded her of home. The humans who greeted her were warm and welcoming. They smiled. They shook her hand, a gesture she had learned meant friendship. They gave her a tour of their capital city and showed her their museums and their parks and their schools. Velkith was charmed. She thought this assignment would be easy. On her third day, she requested access to human historical records. The humans happily agreed. They seemed proud of their history. They had kept detailed records going back thousands of years. Velkith settled into her quarters that night with a data tablet full of human knowledge. Expecting to find the usual story of gradual progress and moral development, what she found instead made her stop, breathing for 6 full seconds. The humans had detailed records of their own atrocities. They did not hide them or destroy them or pretend they never happened. They preserved them. They taught them to their children. They built museums dedicated to remembering the terrible things they had done to each other. Velkith, read about wars fought over invisible lines drawn on maps. She read about people enslaved because of the color of their skin. She read about entire populations murdered because of their beliefs or their ancestry. She read about leaders who sent millions to die for power or pride or resources. But the thing that truly disturbed her was not the atrocities themselves. Every species had violence in its past. What disturbed her was the context. The humans had philosophers. They had moral teachers. They had religious leaders who preached kindness and compassion. They had scientists who understood consequences. They had writers who imagined better futures. They knew what was right. They had written it down in beautiful words that moved Velkith to tears. And then they had done the opposite. She found a human general who had studied ethics at their finest university, who had written essays on the value of human life, who then ordered the destruction of entire cities. She found business leaders who understood environmental science perfectly and chose to ignore it for profit. She found politicians who gave speeches about justice while passing laws that created injustice. Velkith stayed awake for 3 nights reading. She barely ate. She paced her quarters and talked to herself and questioned everything she thought. She knew about sapient minds. On the 4th morning, she filed an emergency report to the Collective Council. The classification was urgent. The threat level was unknown. The recommendation was unprecedented. She wrote that humans were not broken, though at first she had thought they might be. Their moral processing was not malfunctioning. They understood right and wrong as clearly as any species she had studied. They could articulate ethical principles with stunning precision. They could debate the finer points of justice and mercy and duty. They simply did not always follow what they knew. Velkith had never encountered this before. She had never imagined it was possible. A species that could see the right path with perfect clarity and still walk the wrong one. A species that could know the consequences of their actions and choose those actions. Anyway, she did not know what to make of them. She did not know if they were dangerous or pitiable or something else entirely. She only knew that everything she thought she understood about consciousness needed to be reconsidered. The council received her report with alarm. They sent additional observers. They commissioned studies. They debated in closed sessions what to do about this strange species on the edge of the galaxy. But Velkith stayed on Earth. She was not finished studying. She had discovered a mystery, and she needed to understand it. How could a species that knew right still choose wrong? And more importantly, what did it mean when they chose right anyway? She did not know yet that she would soon find out. The Kravik swarm arrived in the Sol system without warning on a cold morning in December. Their fleet darkened the sky above every major human city. Their ships numbered in the thousands. Their message was simple and direct. Velkith watched the broadcast from her quarters in the human capital. She had seen this before. She had seen it 19 times on 19 different worlds. The Kravik were a harvesting species. They consumed civilizations the way humans consume grain. They were efficient and methodical and utterly without mercy. The terms they offered were standard. Surrender 70% of your population for harvesting. The remaining 30% will be spared to rebuild. You have one cycle to respond. Velkith knew what would happen next. She had studied the records of every species that faced the Kravik. Some fought and were exterminated completely. Most accepted the terms. They wept and mourned and selected who would die and who would live. They made the logical choice. They preserved what they could preserve. The humans called an emergency council of their world leaders. Velkith was permitted to observe. She expected arguments and accusations and the slow grinding acceptance of inevitable defeat. She had seen this too many times. What she saw instead was something new. A young diplomat named Marcus Chen stood before the assembled leaders. He was tired. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. His hand shook slightly as he held his notes. He had been given the task of presenting the military analysis. The probability of successful resistance was 12%. The probability of total extinction if they fought was 43%. The numbers were clear. Chun put down his notes. He looked at the other leaders. And then he said a single word. No. The room erupted. Some leaders shouted in anger. Others demanded an explanation. A few sat in stunned silence. Velkith watched Chen's face. She saw fear there, genuine and deep. But she saw something else too. Something she did not have a name for yet. Chun waited for the noise to die down. Then he spoke again. He said he had read the ethicists. He had read the philosophers. He had read all the arguments for sacrificing the majority to save the minority. Some of those arguments were persuasive. Some of them were logical. Some of them might even be right, but he could not do it. He could not look at 4 billion people and say they were the acceptable loss. He could not sign the paper that sent them to die. Not because he was brave, not because he was certain, but because he knew, deep in his bones, that it was wrong. And even if resisting was foolish, even if it meant the end of everything, he would rather face that end fighting than live with the knowledge that he had chosen who would be harvested. The room was silent. Then, one by one, the other leaders nodded. Not all of them, but enough. The response to the Kravik was transmitted 2 hours later. The answer was no. Velkith intercepted Chun in the corridor afterward. She needed to understand. She needed to know why he had done what he did. He looked at her with exhausted eyes. He almost laughed, but it came out wrong, broken, and strange. "Ambassador," he said, "you have been studying us for 2 years. Have you not figured it out yet?" Velkith admitted that she had not. Chine leaned against the wall. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he told her what she had been missing. "Humans," he said, "always know the right thing to do. They write books about it. They teach it in schools. They give speeches about it. And then they look at the easy path, the safe path, the path that asks them to be small and afraid and compliant. Sometimes they take that easy path. Sometimes they choose wrong. Sometimes they do terrible things, even though they know better. But sometimes, he said, they choose to be better than they are. Not because they do not know the cost. Because they know it. Because they have stared at the numbers and understood exactly what they are risking. And they choose anyway. Velketh asked him if he was not afraid. Chun said of course he was afraid. He was terrified. He had not slept in days. He knew he might have just signed the death warrant of his entire species. But fear, he said, was not the same as guidance. Fear told you what was dangerous. It did not tell you what was right. The Kravik fleet began its approach the next morning. They expected surrender. They had done this 19 times before. No species had ever truly resisted once they understood the math. The humans understood the math. They had calculated every probability. They had modeled every scenario. They knew exactly how outmatched they were. They launched their fighters. Anyway, Velketh watched from the observation deck of a human command center. She watched young pilots climb into ships they knew might become their coffins. She watched commanders give orders they knew might be their last. She watched ordinary people volunteer for missions with survival rates in single digits. And she began to understand something she had never understood before. The Sereni acted on moral knowledge like it was gravity. Automatic, inevitable, effortless. The humans had to fight for it. Every single time. The war lasted 4 years. Velketh stayed on Earth through all of it. She told herself she was gathering data for the collective. But the truth was simpler. She could not look away. She watched human soldiers march into battles they had calculated as suicide missions. They had the numbers displayed on screens before them. They knew the odds. They went anyway. Not from ignorance. Not from blind rage. From choice. She watched pilots fly interceptors against Kravik battleships 100 times their size. They wrote letters to their families before launching. They made jokes about their probable deaths. They climbed into their cockpits with clear eyes and steady hands. She watched civilians in occupied territories form resistance cells. They had access to the same intelligence as everyone else. They knew the Kravik would find them eventually. They knew what would happen when they were caught. They organized supply lines and sabotage operations and hidden schools for their children. Anyway, the Kravik did not understand. They had consumed 19 species. They had perfect models for how civilizations responded to overwhelming force. They expected the humans to break within months. They expected surrender or extinction. What they got was something else entirely. A Gavol, human commander named Okonkwo, became famous during the second year of the war. She was brilliant and ruthless and uncompromising. She had won 3 battles that military analysts had declared unwinnable. She had become a symbol of human resistance. Velketh requested permission to observe one of her command sessions. Okonkwo agreed. She seemed curious about the alien who watched humanity so intently. The session was for a major engagement. Okonkwo's forces were defending a manufacturing sector that produced weapons critical to the war effort. If they held, human production would continue. If they fell, the war might be lost within a year. Okonkwo studied the tactical display. The Kravik were approaching with superior numbers. She could hold the line if she committed all her reserves. The casualties would be catastrophic, but there was a chance, perhaps 30%, that they could turn the tide of the entire war, or she could retreat, save 8,000 soldiers, cede the manufacturing sector, fight another day from weaker ground. Velketh watched Okonkwo's face as she made her calculations. She ran a neural scanner, a device she had used on thousands of individuals across hundreds of species. She could see the activity in Okonkwo's brain. She could see the moment when Okonkwo understood what the heroic choice would be. Okonkwo ordered the retreat. Her officers protested. Some accused her of cowardice. One threw his communicator against the wall and stormed out. Okonkwo watched them go with a face that showed nothing. Later, when the command center was empty, Velkith approached her. She asked why Okonkwo had not made the heroic choice. She had seen the neural patterns. Okonkwo had known exactly what a true hero would have done. Okonkwo laughed. It was a tired sound, old beyond her years. Being a hero is easy, she said. You just have to not care about the people you sacrifice. You make the grand gesture. You take the glorious risk. And if it fails, well, you tried your best. Your conscience is clean. She looked at Velkith with eyes that had seen too much. But those 8,000 soldiers have families. They have children who need fathers and mothers. They have futures that do not belong to me. And I could see them, all of them, in my mind when I looked at that tactical display. She sat down heavily. That is the human superpower, Ambassador. We can always find a way to justify the wrong thing. We can always tell ourselves a story that makes cruelty sound noble and sacrifice sound beautiful. So the real fight is never out there. She tapped her temple. It is in here. Every single time. Velkith stayed with Okonkwo's forces for another year. She watched them lose battles and win battles. She watched them mourn their dead with rituals that acknowledged exactly what had been lost. She watched them make terrible choices and live with those choices and keep fighting anyway. She began to understand something about humans that no other Sereni had ever grasped. Other species acted on moral knowledge because they had no alternative. Their brains processed right and wrong and produced action automatically. There was no struggle. There was no choice. There was only the moral calculation and its inevitable result. Humans had to choose. Every time. With full knowledge of what they were choosing and what it would cost. Their moral sense did not compel them. It only informed them. The decision remained theirs. This was why they could commit such terrible atrocities. But it was also why their acts of goodness meant something different than the goodness of other species. When a Sereni did the right thing, it was like water flowing downhill. Natural, automatic, effortless. When a human did the right thing, it was a victory. A small rebellion against their own darker impulses. A choice to be better than they knew themselves to be. Velkith began to see the war differently after that. Not as a conflict between species, but as a species-wide example of what humans did every day on a smaller scale. They knew the odds. They knew the cost. They knew that giving in would be easier and safer and more logical. They kept fighting anyway. The war ended in the 4th year, though ended was not quite the right word. The humans did not win. They could not win. The Kravik were too powerful, too numerous, too technologically advanced. But the Kravik did not win either. They had expected consumption. What they got was cost. Every ship they lost was a ship that could not harvest other worlds. Every soldier they sacrificed was a soldier removed from future campaigns. Every month the war continued was a month their expansion stalled. The humans made them bleed. Not enough to defeat them, but enough to matter. In the end, the Kravik calculated that Earth was simply not worth the trouble. The resources they would gain from harvesting humanity had become less valuable than the resources they were spending to obtain them. The math no longer worked. They withdrew. Velkith watched the last Kravik ship leave the solar system on a quiet morning in spring. The humans gathered in their cities and wept. Some wept from joy. Some wept from grief for all they had lost. Most wept from both at once. She had spent 4 years among them. She had watched them at their worst and their best. She had seen cruelty and courage and cowardice and compassion. sometimes from the same individuals on the same day. She finally understood them, and the understanding filled her with something she could only call awe. The Galactic Council demanded a full report. They needed to know how to classify humanity. They needed to know if humans were a threat or an ally or something else entirely. They needed to know what this strange species on the edge of the galaxy meant for the future of the known universe. Velkith spent 3 months writing her report. She revised it 17 times. She struggled to find words that would make other Sireni understand what she had learned. In the end, she kept it simple. She wrote that most species developed sapience and then moral intuition. They became capable of understanding right and wrong, and they followed that understanding as naturally as they breathed. This was how consciousness worked. This was how the universe made sense. Humans were different. Humans had developed moral knowledge before they developed a neural architecture to automatically implement it. They could see the right path with perfect clarity and walk the wrong one anyway. Evolution had given them conscience without compulsion, understanding without automation, knowledge without the chains that bound other species to act on that knowledge. This should have made them monsters. And sometimes it did. Their history proved it. They were capable of atrocities that would make a Kravik commander flinch. But it also meant something else. Something that changed everything. Every act of human goodness was a choice. Every kindness was a rebellion against their own darker impulses. When a human helped a stranger, they were not following programming. They were deciding to be better than they knew themselves to be. This was why humans were dangerous. A species that knew right and did wrong could commit horrors beyond imagination. They had the knowledge and the freedom and the capability. Nothing automatic stopped them, but a species that had to choose to be good, that had to fight for it, that had to sacrifice for it, could become anything. They were not limited by their biology. They were not constrained by their evolution. They could choose to be better tomorrow than they were today. And sometimes they did. Velkith ended her report with a recommendation. It was the only recommendation she had ever made that was unanimously adopted by the Collective Council. Do not threaten humanity. Do not corner them. Do not give them a reason to see you as an enemy. And whatever you do, do not give them a cause they believe is worth dying for. They will fight for it with full knowledge of the cost. They will sacrifice for it with clear eyes and steady hands. They will choose courage even when fear would be easier and safer and more logical. They are not the strongest species in the galaxy. They are not the smartest. They are not the most advanced. But they are the only species that has to earn their goodness every single day. And that makes them capable of things no other species could imagine. The report became required reading at the Collective Academy. Xenologists across the galaxy studied it and debated it, and struggled to understand its implications. Velkith returned to Earth. She had been offered promotions, positions of honor, comfortable retirements. She turned them all down. She had found something on Earth that she had never found anywhere else. A species that made her believe that the universe was stranger and more wonderful than she had ever imagined. A species that showed her that consciousness was not a prison but a possibility. She wanted to see what they would choose next. The humans welcomed her back. They remembered the Sireni who had stayed with them through the war. They called her friend. They invited her to their homes and their celebrations and their memorials for the dead. She lived among them for many years after that. She watched them choose wrong and choose right. She watched them fail and succeed. She watched them struggle with the same battles they had always struggled with, the battle between what was easy and what was good. And she never stopped being amazed. They were terrifying. They were beautiful. They were the species that knew right and chose wrong. And sometimes, against all odds, they chose right anyway. That was what made them human.